Hello everyone and welcome to another Endgame episode with Coach B and MasterChess.com. This is the second part of the video that involves a rook versus two separated pawns. In the first part, we looked at the positions where the defending king that has the pawn was not near the pawns, while the attacking king that has the rook was near his pawns. Then we also looked at the positions where both kings were near the pawns. In this second part, we're going to take a look at the positions where the rook is going to try to fight alone against the two pawns. Sometimes both kings are far away, or sometimes the defending king is near the pawns. For these positions, we're going to take a look at the positions where the separated pawns are more than one file apart, and then we're also going to take a look at the positions where the pawns are only one file apart, as the play will be different for those two cases. So let's get started. First, we're going to take a look at the positions where the pawns are more than one file apart and the rook is fighting alone against those pawns. And I want to mention that black is playing for a draw here since his king is far away and the rook cannot capture any of the pawns. If the rook is going to go capture one of the pawns right away, well, since both pawns are on the 7th rank, the other pawn will promote and black will lose this game. However, coming back, with correct play, black is able to draw this game. And the rule is this: if both pawns are on the 7th rank and they are separated by 4 or more squares in between, the rook alone is able to achieve a draw. So let's go over the correct play. After something like rook to h8, let's say king to c6, since black cannot capture the pawn, we're going to move the king to c3. And white cannot promote the pawn on its own as the rook will simply be able to take it, so he's going to need the king to step to b7 to help the pawn on a7 promote. But after the king moves to b7, now is the time to take the pawn on h7 because black is able to take that pawn with check, and after the king moves away, the rook will simply be able to capture the other pawn, achieving a draw. In this next position, both pawns are on the 7th rank and they are separated by 4 squares in between, therefore black should be able to achieve a draw in this case. And there are two ways that white can try to play this game. He can try to use the king to help the pawn on b7 promote, or he can use the king to challenge the rook and go and try to promote the pawn on g7. So let's take a look at both of those scenarios. With black to move here, after rook to g8, let's take a look at king to c6, trying to promote the pawn on b7 first. Well, here black can move the king to c3. If white moves the king to c7, well, now black can capture the pawn on g7 with check. After the king moves away, the rook can sacrifice for the other pawn, achieving a draw. Coming back, if instead of moving the king to c7, if here white is trying king to b6, well, after king to c4, let's say king to a7, well, now again, black can capture the pawn on g7 as the pawn on b7 is pinned to the king, and he's going to be able to capture that pawn as well, sacrificing the rook and achieving a draw. And coming back from the very beginning, after rook to g8, we looked at the king trying to help the pawn on b7 promote, but another way to play is to try to use the king to attack the rook on g8. So after something like king to e6, the correct play is rook to b8. If king moves to d6, the rook needs to go to g8. Black needs to make sure that he's not going to allow the white king to attack the rook and defend the pawn at the same time, because if he allows that, then he's going to lose this game. For example, after king to e6, if black is not going to move the rook to b8, which would be the correct move, and he's going to make a move with the king, let's say king to c3, well, now white is going to be able to attack the rook and defend the pawn on g7 with the move king to f7. And now black is lost. After rook to b8, the pawn will promote, and then the rook will have to sacrifice. After the king takes the rook and king to c4, the other pawn will promote and white will win the game. In this next position, we can see that both pawns are on the 7th rank. However, they are separated only by 3 squares in between. Therefore, black is not able to get a draw here. So if we try, let's say rook to f8, after king to e6, rook to b8, king to d6, black only has 2 tries. He can try to move the king to c3. Well, if he does that, then king to c7 attacks the rook and defends the pawn at the same time. And here, after rook to f8, the pawn will promote, the rook will have to sacrifice, and now white will be able to promote the other pawn and win the game from here. And coming back, after king to d6, we looked at king to c3. No better is rook to f8 here, because white can still attack the rook and defend the pawn at the same time. So after this, white will move the king to e7, the pawn is defended and the rook is attacked. After the rook moves away, white will promote his pawn and the rook will have to sacrifice, and then the other pawn will promote. Again, white will win the game. Next, we're going to take a look at the positions where the pawns are not both on the 7th rank. For these positions, the rook will also need the help of the king to be able to stop those pawns. Just because the pawns are not both on the 7th rank, capturing a pawn will not check or pin the other pawn to the king, as we've seen in the other type of positions. And the easiest way to calculate these positions is when your opponent has the move, you want to count how many moves it's going to take his king to reach the promotion square, and how many moves it's going to take your king to reach the square of the pawn that it's on the other side. If those moves are equal, then you will be able to draw. So in this position, if it's black to move, after king to b2, now our opponent has the move. And this is where you want to start counting. And if we count for white, it's going to take him 1, 2, 3 moves to reach the promotion square for the pawn on b7 with the king. And for black, it's going to take 1, 2, 3 moves to enter the square of the pawn on g5. Therefore, black should be able to get a draw here with correct play. So if white moves the king to c6, black will move the king to c3. After king to c7, white will move the king to d4. If white promotes the pawn on b8, the rook will sacrifice, the king will take, and now black will move the king to e5, entering the square of the pawn on g5, which means he's going to be able to capture it before he will promote. So after g6, king to f6, pawn to g7, the black king will capture the pawn, reaching a draw. And coming back from the beginning, after king to b2, king to c6, and king to c3, if here white is not going to go with the king to c7, if he's going to push the other pawn, let's say pawn to g6, well, we still can continue with king to d4. After pawn to g7, now both pawns are on the 7th rank. Here, technically, even the rook alone can stop both of these pawns now, but we could also use the king. So after something like king to e5, king to c7, king to e6, after the pawn promotes, we'll be able to sacrifice our rook, since the king will reach the square f7 and be able to capture the other pawn. Coming back after pawn to g7, black can simply stop those pawns just with the rook. After rook to g8 and king to c7, black will be able to take the pawn on g7 with check, and after the king moves away, we're going to sacrifice the rook, achieving a draw this way as well. And in the end of these type of positions, I want to close with 2 exercise problems that you could pause the video to see if you can apply what you've learned in this video. So for this position, it's black to move. Pause the video and see if you will be able to achieve a draw. Okay, assuming that you've paused the video and analyzed the position, I'm going to continue with the answer. So here, after king to b2, now the opponent has the move, and now we're going to start counting how many moves it's going to take his king to reach the promotion square for the pawn that he's closest to, and how many moves it's going to take us to enter the square of the pawn for the pawn on b5. Well, if we count for white, it's going to take 1, 2 moves to reach the square g8, which is the promotion square, while for us, it's going to take us 1, 2, 3 moves to be next to the pawn. Therefore, just because he has 2 moves and we only have 3 moves, we will not be able to get a draw in this case, even with correct play. So let's go through the position and let's take a look why. So after king to f7, king to c3, after the pawn promotes and the rook will sacrifice for the pawn, black is a square behind and he's not going to be able to catch the white pawn from promoting, and then he's going to lose the game. Coming back, I do want to mention that after king to f7, no better is rook to d7 check here, because after this the king will move to g6. Now black has to cover the promotion square, so rook to d8. After king to h7, rook to d7, pinning the pawn. The white king can go to h8. The rook will have to sacrifice for the pawn, and now the black king is not going to catch the other pawn from promoting because he's too far behind. Coming back from the beginning, I do want to mention that the only way that black can hope for a draw here is incorrect play by white. For example, if white plays king to e7 attacking the rook here, now the rook could go to b8, targeting the pawn on b5. And after king to x7, rook to b7 check. King to g6, rook to b8. King to h7, rook to b7, pinning the pawn. And here, if white makes the mistake of moving the king to h8, well, now black can achieve a draw. He can take the pawn on b5. After the pawn promotes, black can go with the rook to h5 check. After king to g5, rook to g5 is a skewer. After the king moves away, the rook will take the queen, achieving a draw. However, coming back, even after the pin on b7, white can still win here with correct play. The correct move here is pawn to b6. If white makes this move, then black cannot get a draw anymore. After something like king to c3, king will go to h8, and now taking the pawn on b6 will not save black, because after the pawn promotes, rook to h6 check, king to g7, rook to g6 check. This is not a skewer anymore, as the white king can simply take the rook. The best try is to keep your rook next to the king and try to fight with the rook against the queen, but white has the advantage and has winning potential. In this last position, I want you to pause the video again and think about how you'd play this position, and then press resume when you have a plan. Assuming that you've analyzed the position, I'm going to go ahead and continue with the correct play. Well, if you thought about rook to f8, this is actually not correct. What's going to happen after f3 and rook to f4 attacking both pawns, the other pawn will move to b4, and now after we capture the pawn on g4, we are left with two pawns that are separated by 3 squares only. So the rook will not be able to fight against those pawns if they both reach the 7th rank. So here, after b3, if white tries rook to g3, well, this will fail because after the pawn moves to f2 and we're going to go and capture the other pawn, the pawn on the f file will promote. And coming back, if we try rook to g1 here to cover both promotion squares, well, here after pawn to f2 attacking the rook will have to go to f1, and now pawn to b2, both pawns reach the 7th rank, but they're separated only by 3 squares in between, which means the rook will not be able to hold on to this position. So after king to b7, king to d4, king to d6, king to d3, rook to b1, the black king will be able to attack the rook and defend his pawn at the same time. So after king to c2, the rook will move away, the pawn will promote, and after the rook sacrifices, white will not be able to capture the other pawn as he's too far away. So coming back from the very beginning, the correct play here is rook to g8. After this, if the pawn moves to g3, rook to g4, attacking both pawns. And now there's two ways that black can play this game. He can try to march the pawn to f3. Well, after this, rook will take the pawn on g3, and after f2, the rook will go behind it. He's going to be able to capture that pawn and then sacrifice the rook for the last pawn, achieving a draw. And coming back after rook to g4, a better try will be pawn to b4. After this, rook will take the pawn on f4, and now the pawns are separated by 4 squares in between. After b3, rook to f1, covering both promotion squares. King to c4, rook to g1. Pawn to b2, king to b7. Pawn to g2, king to c6. And now you could see that the rook alone can stop both of the pawns since they're on the 7th rank and they are separated by 4 more squares. Alright, thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for part 3 where we're going to take a look at the pawns that are separated by 1 square in between and the type of play that is required for those type of positions. If you liked my video, please subscribe and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.